I'm David Krieger. I'm the president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, headquartered in Santa Barbara. Russia really doesn't need to be particularly concerned with our missile defenses, at least as we're planning to proceed now. Russia, has more than enough missiles capable of overcoming those missile defenses. So for Russia to get involved would be only to rejoin the game playing that went on for so long during the Cold War. On the other hand, China's strategy is, I think, is a longer-term strategy. They are going to build up their offensive forces, but they're probably not going to rush right into it. They're going to take their time. They're going to see what's coming down the pipeline with the U.S. missile defense system, and they'll build up as they go. I mean, they have research and development in progress. They've indicated that they're going to be building up their offensive forces, and I think there's every reason for them to do so under the current set of circumstances. China said to the United States, if you go ahead with missile defenses, we will need to develop our missile forces and our nuclear forces in order to be able to have some minimum deterrent force against the United States. And I think the response of the United States, the government at that time, was really shocking. Essentially, the response was, go ahead, build them up, be our guest. We're not really building these missile defenses against you, and if you want to build up your offensive missile forces, please go right ahead. Totally irresponsible policy on the part of the United States government, really acting not in the interests of the American people or in the interests of global security. Bush and Putin entered into an agreement called the Strategic Offensive Reduction Treaty, or SORT for short. It's a fraudulent treaty. It's an absolutely outrageous agreement in which the two presidents, well, primarily President Bush, who forced this treaty largely on the Russians, has developed a public relations model for allowing the United States to continue its nuclear strategy in perpetuity. And basically what this treaty does is that it removes some actively deployed strategic offensive weapons from not from the U.S. arsenal, but from active deployment. It'll take some 4,000 weapons on each side and put them on the shelf rather than destroying them. So the American people, and for that matter the Russian people, have the perception, I think, from the way this was reported, that there's actually been some major reductions in the number of nuclear arms on each side. In fact, the reduction is only a transfer from active deployment into a reserve category. And I think that, while I'm happy to see the numbers actively deployed go down, that's all good and fine. It's not really an arms reduction treaty. It's an arms transfer treaty, and it's a public relations treaty, but it's not a disarmament treaty, and it's not really an arms reduction treaty. Those weapons that they take off of active deployment are going to go on the shelf. Bush has already said that we're going to be putting the weapons we take off of active deployment into storage somewhere. Well, fine. That's exactly what the Russians will do as a result. And when the Russians put their weapons on the shelf, they will become available for terrorists, because we know the Russians have problems in safeguarding their nuclear forces now. It'll even be a greater problem once they put these weapons on the shelf. So I think it is in keeping with the Bush administration a totally idiotic plan to deceive the American people, while at the same time making it more likely that nuclear weapons will fall into the hands of terrorists and end up harming the American people. It's a treaty that, as I say, is fraudulent and undermines the security of the American people, and people all over the world. Clearly, in signing this Strategic Offensive Reduction Treaty, Russia has been co-opted. The Russians wanted to go to a lower level. I mean, they were talking for a long time about reducing nuclear arms down to 1,500 or even 1,000 strategic nuclear weapons. And they didn't want missile defenses. They didn't want the United States to abrogate the anti-ballistic missile treaty and proceed with missile defenses. The United States is using its unprecedented power in the form of being a bully, and it's just such an enormous loss to the world that the Russians couldn't take a stronger position and push for what they wanted, which was far deeper cuts in strategic nuclear arsenals and irreversible cuts in strategic arsenals. And the United States has created a situation where there are, in essence, no cuts, just transfers, and they're far from reversible. The whole point of what Bush has been trying to push in this agreement is reversibility, easy reversibility. When I saw the reports of this treaty, there were banner headlines in our local paper in Santa Barbara, in the Los Angeles Times, talking about nuclear reductions. You know, Bush and Putin agree to nuclear cuts, but not really telling the story that the cuts were simply the transfer of these weapons from immediate active deployment to strategic reserves. Maybe if they did mention that at all, it was way down, buried in the article. So I think any average American person reading those articles, seeing the headlines, would get a totally different feeling and understanding of what happened than what really happened. The Nuclear Posture Review, which was released to Congress in January of 2002, and you know, it's actually a secret document which was only leaked to the public and through the press, through portions of it getting into the press, is a blueprint for United States policy in the future. And what that blueprint essentially says is we are prepared to use nuclear weapons. We are planning to keep our nuclear weapons as part of our defense plan in perpetuity. We have intentions to draw up contingency plans to use nuclear weapons against at least 7 countries, 5 of which are non-nuclear weapon states, which is in complete contravention to our obligations and previous promises. Russia is on that list. China is on that list as 2 nuclear weapon states. And then there are the states that have been designated as the axis of evil: Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, and Syria and Libya. You know, if you were in one of those countries, you'd have to take pause knowing that the United States was drawing up contingency plans to use nuclear weapons against your country. In fact, it's an invitation. That Nuclear Posture Review is almost an invitation to nuclear proliferation. Just as the United States claims to use its nuclear weapons for deterrence, so other countries would want to have a deterrent force, whether or not it would actually work, but they'd want to have a deterrent force if they understood that some other country, in this case the United States, was drawing up contingency plans to use nuclear weapons against them. The Nuclear Posture Review also talks about developing smaller, more usable nuclear weapons, bunker-busting nuclear weapons. Very dangerous policy. That's a policy that means that the United States is thinking about how it might actually make use of nuclear weapons for purposes beyond deterrence. It's telegraphing to the world. It's telling the world that the United States is actually contemplating the use of these weapons under certain circumstances. The missile defense plans of the United States are built into that policy. It looks to me like what our nuclear posture review and our nuclear policy in the United States is contemplating is the equivalent of a feudal regime building up its castle walls. And missile defense is the poor equivalent of castle walls. It's the delusional belief that you can defend yourself against nuclear weapons. So the United States would like to have everything going its way with regard to nuclear weapons. It would like to build this shield, which I say is delusional because it will never work, but it would like to convince the American people, perhaps, that they can be protected by missile defenses. So that's the castle wall and the moat around the castle. And then inside the castle, the United States intends to keep its nuclear weapons and to continue threatening countries that it thinks countries that don't seem to agree with U.S. policy for whatever issue. Preemption is the concept that if you think that some danger might be coming down the line, that you have some right to initiate a preemptive attack against the source of that danger. You know, preemption is actually, in my view, a euphemism for aggressive warfare. It's a kind of warfare that's outlawed by the United Nations Charter. The Charter of the United Nations gives, and under international law, you have a right to use force only in two circumstances. One, if there's an explicit authorization to use force after all other means have failed, and that authorization comes from the United Nations, or on a very short-term basis for purposes of self-defense. Preemption turns that on its head, and preemption says a state can go out and initiate a preemptive attack and decide itself when that's right and appropriate. If every state took upon itself the same policy of preemption, it would throw the world into chaos. It would totally undermine international law as it's been accepted in the aftermath of World War II. If you can engage in this preemptive or aggressive warfare, that means you can decide when and where you'll strike. And if the other side is mostly wiped out with your preemptive attack, but say it has only a missile or two left, very little offensive force, but it has one or two missiles, well, maybe missile defenses would be adequate to deal with that level of threat. They might not be, but they might be adequate, and at least United States defense planners, so-called defense planners, would feel more confident that they could go ahead and rain havoc and commit war and atrocities against other nations and have this missile shield, so-called missile shield, backing them up to mop up any remaining offensive power that state might still have. The U.S. Is definitely isolating itself from the rest of the world by its policies. We're thumbing our nose at international law. We're thumbing our nose at policies that virtually all of our allies in Europe and other parts of the world think are right and proper. I mean, there's so many instances in international law where the United States has simply expressed hostility toward the will of most nations in the world, including our allies. The landmines treaty, the U.S. won't support that. The comprehensive test ban treaty that was signed under the Clinton administration, but the Senate failed to ratify, and the anti-ballistic missile treaty, a treaty that was 30 years old, Bush summarily pulled out of in order to develop missile defenses and in order to weaponize space. And that's a huge problem also, that the plans of the United States military to so-called seize the so-called high ground of outer space, what they call the new high frontier, and use that as a source of security by weaponizing space, security for the American people. It's anything but security. If we go ahead and weaponize space and other countries follow in our footsteps and we have new arms races in space, or even open up the possibilities to begin destroying the communications satellites and the satellites that are set up for understanding locations around the Earth and so forth, again, it could lead to havoc and totally the wrong direction to go in. But that's the door that Mr. Bush was opening by pulling out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. If the most powerful nation in the world won't lead by example that international law is right and necessary, the other countries in the world are going to get the idea that they should do as the United States does rather than as it says. In terms of whether the United States' unilateral positions and developing policies like preemptive strikes and preemptive war, if those are leading to our vilification in the world, I think they are, and I think it's appropriate. I mean, the United States is following policies that are bad for the world, policies that are undermining the security of all nations. So to the extent that they're creating enemies out there, to the extent they're isolating us and making us more alone, I think other countries are acting on principle in taking those positions. So I think that's absolutely right. And in terms of whether our unilateral actions are helping our national security or undermining our national security, I would say that very strongly they're undermining our security. And every time we use military force, which is a very blunt instrument, such as in the way we used it in Afghanistan, such as the way we're contemplating using it in Iraq, every time that we do that, we kill innocent people by our bombing from 30,000 feet, and we create whole new cadres of terrorists. And as we create serious enemies by these policies, we're building up more and more potential for terrorists to strike out at us in the only way that they think that they can be heard. And when they strike at the symbols of American power and they kill American citizens, they're looking at that as collateral damage in the same way that when the United States bombs from 30,000 feet and kills innocent civilians, we call it collateral damage. I think that the anti-ballistic missile defense movement has to some extent been compromised by the failure of the Russians and the Chinese to continue speaking out strongly against these plans to build missile defenses. It helps in capturing media attention. If the media doesn't think that there's some problem and some conflict, they're not going to give much attention to the issue. And when the Russians and the Chinese are speaking out and making it clear that it's a problem for the United States to go forward with missile defenses, the media will pay attention. When it's left to peace workers and to Americans and people in other countries who are opposing these missile defenses, ordinary people speaking out, the media tends to ignore them, and that's a problem. That is a problem. So, it just means that those of us who oppose these policies that are these policies such as missile defense, which are detrimental to our overall security, we need to redouble our efforts to raise these issues, and we need to ask, where are the other countries in the world when it comes, and particularly Russia and China, when it comes to speaking out on policies that are clearly detrimental to their interests. I think that the United States plans to move forward with missile defenses are, without a doubt, going to trigger China building up its offensive forces. When China builds up its offensive forces, it's very likely that India will build up its offensive nuclear forces in response. and if India builds up its nuclear forces, then it's likely that Pakistan will continue building up its nuclear forces. China is not in this to compete with the United States. It never has been. It's always kept what is considered to be a minimal deterrent force. Now, if the United States goes ahead and builds ballistic missile defenses regionally in North Asia and nationally with regard to protecting U.S. territory, China is going to want to be able to maintain a minimal defense deterrence force. I mean, they've told us that over and over again. They've said we need to maintain this minimal deterrence force so that we won't feel threatened by a first strike attack against from the United States. So if the United States builds 200 missile defense launchers, China is going to feel that it needs to have something more than 200 missiles carrying nuclear weapons capable of attacking the United States so that its entire missile force won't be neutralized and the United States get the idea that it can attack China with nuclear weapons using its new doctrine of preemption and do that with impunity. So China will be building up its nuclear forces. I don't think they're doing it as an arms race, but I think that they will do it in their own, what they believe to be their own self-interest, and they'll be doing it only for one reason, and that is because the United States is developing missile defenses. The ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, was set up in 1972 purposefully to limit the number of sites and the number of missiles that could be used in defense. The thinking then was that if you develop missile defensive postures and develop missile defenses to protect your own country, that's going to drive a greater development of offensive capabilities, so that in the end that we would have more of an offensive nuclear arms race if we allowed a defensive nuclear arms race to go on. So that was the thinking behind the ABM Treaty. I don't think that we're going to re-enter an arms race with the Russians, although who knows what the future holds? Who knows what's possible? We've been behaving toward the Russians in many respects as though we are, in the words of one former commander of the U.S. Strategic Command, poking a stick in their eye, poking the NATO stick in their eye. So we don't know where things are going to go in the future. By abrogating the ABM Treaty, I think the real prize there is not missile defenses. I think the real prize is embedded in Article 5 of that treaty, which limits testing of defenses and the emplacement of weapons in outer space. I think the real prize in getting rid of the ABM Treaty for the Bush administration is the weaponization of outer space. The events of September 11th should have changed the debate in the United States on the issue of missile defense, but I don't think it has, unfortunately. What September 11th taught us, the lesson of September 11th, was we are all vulnerable. Even the most powerful country in the world is vulnerable. And the United States is vulnerable to terrorism. And I don't think there's probably anything we can do but build friendships and cooperation throughout the world to diminish that vulnerability. I don't think we're going to diminish the vulnerability by our military approach to solving the problem. So clearly, the terrorists who attacked the World Trade Towers and the Pentagon on September 11th wouldn't have been stopped by missile defenses. And if they had had a nuclear weapon, they wouldn't have been stopped by missile defenses. They would have come in under the radar screen. I describe missile defenses as a Maginot Line in the sky. We've written a book about missile defenses, and it's called A Maginot Line in the Sky. And the Maginot Line was a defensive structure in France before World War II. It was meant to prevent the Germans from again invading France. It was a very high-tech structure for its day. And when it came down to its application, when the Germans decided to invade France, they simply went around the Maginot Line, came in, invaded France, and took it over in a matter of days. I think that what September 11th should have taught us, if anything, is that missile defenses are definitely a Maginot Line in the sky. When either other countries or terrorists want to attack the United States with whatever weapons, they are not going to do it by sending missiles that have a return address on them to the United States so that they can be retaliated against in force. They're going to come in under that Maginot Line in the sky. They're going to bring the weapons in that way. And there's probably no effective way that the United States can ultimately protect itself. And the least effective way of all is missile defenses. It's a total boondoggle. The United States wants to weaponize space. We see it as the new high ground. We've been planning this for a long time. As I said, getting rid of the anti-ballistic missile treaty opens more doors to going into outer space. It takes out some legal obstacles to weaponizing space. So I think weaponizing space is part of our program to dominate the world. We are the Roman Empire of the 21st century, and we are going to put our best weapons everywhere, including outer space. The connection between missile defenses and outer space, I think a lot of research that's being done on missile defenses will have application to placing weapons in outer space. And some of the so-called defensive weapons that we're creating for missile defense may well be located in outer space. So there are definitely connections between the two. We're proceeding with missile defenses and we're proceeding with weaponization of space in parallel, and a lot of the research will promote both. We're going to be spending approximately $8 billion in 2002 on missile defenses. That's a fair amount of money, and overall we'll probably be spending hundreds of billions of dollars if we continue down the road of building missile defenses. So there's a lot of money involved in this project of building missile defenses. There was a study that was done a few years ago. A commission was asked, what do we need to do to prevent loose nukes in Russia from getting into the hands of terrorists? In my opinion, a much higher priority than building missile defenses. If any of those nuclear weapons in Russia get into the hands of terrorists, and those terrorists can get those weapons into the United States or to United States installations overseas, we are in big trouble. Well, the commission, the bipartisan commission headed up by Howard Baker, a Republican, and Lloyd Cutler, a Democrat, came back with the recommendation that the United States should be spending $3 billion a year over the next 10 years to get the Russian nuclear arsenal and nuclear materials under control. Rather than that, we're spending approximately a third of that amount, or $1 billion a year. That means we're spending 8 times as much on missile defenses as we are on controlling the Russian nuclear arsenal from getting in the hands of terrorists. again, that is just bad policy by people who are myopic and I would say rather ill-informed and stupid. Bad policy. It's undermining United States security, and we need to cut off this missile defense nonsense and get on with the real problems of our vulnerability that face the United States and the world. What theater missile defense is intending to do is to make United States military forces and their allies abroad invulnerable to attacks with nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, so that if the United States feels that it wants to engage in a war in Afghanistan or a war in China or a war in Iraq or wherever the United States feels it wants to engage in a war, if it comes up against countries that have some limited capacity to use weapons of mass destruction, it will have its theater missile defenses in place to allow the United States to go forward with whatever plans it has throughout the world. So theater missile defenses are a part of a global strategy of increasing U.S. dominance throughout the world and giving the United States greater degrees of freedom to use its military forces in any way that it chooses, including preemptive or aggressive warfare.